Hello and welcome to the Memory Caps podcast. This is just a quick PSA before our episode starts. There were two interviews I did before NAIC this year with Steffen Eriksen and with Mike Fouché. Unfortunately, because of NAIC being such a long weekend and then me immediately going on a 3-week trip to Europe right afterwards, I was not able to get the editing done for these episodes in time. I am now back from Europe, finishing them up. So if anything is mentioned in these episodes talking about the upcoming meta for NAIC, I apologize. It might not be very relevant anymore, but the vast majority of these episodes is just great conversations with great players about their histories and how much they love the game. So I hope you enjoy, and moving forward, expect some great interviews going into this next season. Have a good one. Hello and welcome to the Memory Caps podcast, where we interview members of the Pokemon trading card game community. My name is Rafal Gladys. Each week we'll be speaking with our guests about their background with the Pokemon TCG, how they got involved with the game, and give them an opportunity to share their love of the game. Today's guest is Steffen Eriksen. Steffen is a player from Denmark with almost 2 decades of Pokemon TCG experiences. He has multiple regionals top finishes and has 11 Worlds invites. He's also the host of the YouTube channel Steffen's Classroom, where he makes informative videos diving into the statistics and math behind the Pokemon TCG. Outside of Pokemon, Steffen is a professor of finance at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. This is actually part 2 of our interview with Steffen. Last week, we spoke to him about his background with the game, how he got involved with the game, and some of his insights about attending tournaments and the last 20 years of Pokemon TCG history. Today's episode will be more of a focus on his Pokemath and Steffen's Classroom YouTube series, where he dives into the math behind the Pokemon TCG. So if any of you are math nerds, you can get your notebooks and pal pads ready to take to take some writing down. We will be referencing some of his videos that were on YouTube. I will make sure all of them are in the show notes, so if anyone gets lost along the way, you are welcome to check the show notes of the episode and follow along with any of our conversations. How are you doing, Steffen?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me, again. And
Of course.
love your Palpad introduction. That one was nice.
Yes,
Nice.
I wanted to slip in as much of a reference as I could.
And just for the viewers out there, it's associate professor. I'm not allowed to, or I don't want to go by professor yet because I haven't reached that level just yet. I hope. I hope one day in the future I'll reach it, but associate professor for now.
I see. Sorry about that.
No worries. I
Yes.
just I don't want to be mistaken for an actual full professor in finance yet.
I see. Well, I wish you the best of luck in your future career. Um,
Thank you.
of course. So, for anyone who might be listening to this and is wondering, why do I care about statistics in Pokemon? I just add up the big numbers on my card. Could you tell us a little bit about just why you believe that math and statistics is so important to understand if you want to succeed in the Pokemon TCG?
Yeah, how do I start? So I think it's a very good idea to mention back what we talked about last time a little bit because I did touch upon it. And I also spoke about how that over time you develop this intuition for the game, whether you actually dive into the math or not, that you develop with practice this understanding. And now we're going to talk about the other side, saying that, okay, you really want to learn the math for actually, believe a multiple number of reasons. Also because I just, first of all, just find it interesting. But what I think it really helps you with is get you a better understanding whether, for instance, when you're deck building, how much it actually matters to add an additional certain card and why some things succeed more than others in terms of, say, consistency. You hear it all over the place again, consistency is key or consistency is king or whatever we want to call it. But it all comes back to the same. That's just based on statistics. We can also talk about shuffling, how that actually works. We can talk about one thing I want to bring up today with mulligans, for instance. Like you sit in the event and sometimes you have if you played for a bit, you've been saved by one of your opponent's mulligan, or you feel like, I'm mulliganing a lot with this here. Why do I give away so many free cards to my opponent? And what are the probabilities of actually doing this? And how does it actually matter that you change the number of cards in your deck? Number of basics in this case. There's so many small things you can do in order to simply improve your own situation and also to promote just a better understanding for the game. And I hope if you're listening to this, it's because you like the game of Pokemon, That's at least a fair assumption, I think. And I hope that also getting some understanding of math behind it would only make you like the game even more. But let's see how we get along today.
Of course. And I do know that you have actually used some concepts within the Pokemon TCG as assignments for your students. So you don't even have to like the Pokemon. You might just like the all the numbers behind it.
Of course, like I think so. I gave just for an assignment case or actually for their final exam. I had master students last year. It was their final exam before they actually obtained their degree, and I conveniently had this nice statistics course running. And some of them they were their last exam. For most of them, it's just an exam at the beginning, but some miss it. And I gave them a literal. I wrote up a Pokemon adventure for them for their last question where they had to search far and wide for each currency to understand the exchange rate that's inside. Really, I wrote it up like really cheesy, really, really, but it was really fun to also just use some of these numbers. And I also just use a lot of example in my everyday teaching when it comes to say pricing of assets. Even when we talk about bubble detection, we talk about just statistical concepts also in my honors college course. So I actually use a lot of components in my own teaching, which I find is incredibly interesting because there's so many things to this game aside from just it's fun to play.
In that case, let's just dive right in. What is the first topic you would like us to cover? You were mentioning mulligans a little bit.
Yeah, I really want to talk mulligans because I could just go on a lot of complicated math or what could be more complicated. But truth is, a lot of players out there don't they never look into the math because well, math is scary or math is evil or I don't like math and I don't understand it. So what I will try to do here is just to try to get some kind of intuitive understanding of say mulligans. I think that's a really good way of starting because it comes back in a lot of calculations. And so I think the example I want to use today is just that we have a nice deck of cards, we have a certain number of basics, and I'm going to sit here and type some numbers. You're going to hear me do it live on the go and simply just calculate a few numbers here and see where we get with it and see how much it changes and explain to everybody what the thought process is. Because yes, there's wonderful tools out there that can actually calculate this for you very quickly. But what I really like to do is go this one step deeper and really understand what are the components to these things. And that's what I hope we can achieve here in just a just a little while. Let's say it like that.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that makes sense.
No, I think that definitely does make sense. Um, so, is there a, and I can edit these parts out, but
Yeah,
is there
sure.
a,
We can. So we start just from episode one. That's always the best
gotcha.
place to go. So I made the series already quite some years ago. I just realized time actually flies, and because the pandemic years never happened, right? It just time flew by, and in one blink we're sitting in mid 2023 now. And I made this first video all the way back in was it 2020? I don't even remember, but a long time ago. But many of the concepts there are still very relevant, and that's also where you will find some of the Mulligan pieces back if you want to go check it out. And I also come back to it often because when you want to calculate other things, you would have to sometimes or very often factor in mulligans. And that's why I want to do mulligans. So I think the best place to start with this is well, let's just recap what is a mulligan. Um, in our game here, it's basically the concept of if you don't open with a basic Pokemon. So you shuffle up your deck properly, of course. Then you draw your opening 7 hands. We check for a basic Pokemon. If there's no basic Pokemon there, we reveal our hand to our opponent. Say we have a mulligan. That's at least how I learned it many years ago, and I assume it's still the same today. And then we will keep going with this process until you have a basic, at least one basic. You can of course open with more, which is perfectly fine. And then the question comes, what's the probability of actually hitting a mulligan? And you can easily extend to say 2 mulligans in a row, 3 mulligans, and it's actually really easy once you got the first one. So I think that's a really good place to start. And of course, you as the interviewer, if there's any clarification notes you need, just stop me because I tend to ramble a lot.
Of course. No, I think you explained mulligans quite well. And one thing that I think some listeners might not know is that if they, especially if they've only played the Pokemon card game, that other card games have pretty different rules regarding mulligans. Like if you've ever played
Yeah.
Yu-Gi-Oh or Magic, like you don't need like a monster down to start your game,
No.
unlike Pokemon. So they
Yeah.
have what they would call a mulligan, but it's much different than ours. It basically, if you have your opening hand and you don't like it, you can shuffle it in and draw another hand with one less card. So you can just say like, "Yeah, this hand isn't good. Let me try to get another one."
Yeah, I find it super cool. Yeah.
So it's a bit of a different process because in those games you don't need to. There's nothing you need to find in order to start the game. You just have to be happy with your hand. In Pokemon, you need to find that one basic. So then it really starts to matter of what are you playing in your deck? How many starters are you happy with starting? Are you playing a deck like Stonejourn or VMAX where you have only four starters? Um,
Yeah, I love your examples here. And it's not as if in Pokemon, if there's no Pokemon in play, we attack the trainer directly or something like that. That's
yeah.
not how this works.
Yeah, if your Pokemon doesn't start anything, you can just attack your opponent.
Exactly. No. But I think it's so cool with mulligans because I didn't know many. I just knew the mulligan system was different in other games, and I learned recently in Magic that they actually shifted their mulligan way here not too long ago, and then they had names for it. There was a Vancouver mulligan style, and there was a London mulligan,
Oh,
and they
really?
differed. Yeah, they differed a little bit. They actually changed their mulligan ruling. I don't even. Somebody who knows more about matching can probably fill us in exactly when this happened, but I just knew it changed from one to the other, and it actually impacted the game quite a lot. So it's super interesting. But as far as I know, Pokemon never changed this. I think Mulligan was always just this, I believe.
Yes, I
Uh,
mean, as far as I've played, that's essentially
yeah,
my knowledge of it. You have always needed a starting Pokemon. So
exactly.
yeah, and the second episode you ever did of Pokemath was specifically in reference to a card called the Dene GX, which many people did not like starting. For anyone who just is starting to play, who is familiar with the new Squawkabilly card that came out, imagine Squawkabilly, except you don't want to start it. You can only play it from your hand to discard your hand and draw six.
I think the best comparison today is starting Luminion, right? That's bad.
Yes. It's essentially useless. There are obviously niche cases. You could always sometimes use Dedene's GX attack to get a turn of paralysis off. I've done that before, but you typically are very, very frustrated. You've seen many opponents that they just go, "Oh, dang it," because they've started their one Luminion. So could you tell us a little bit about calculating that probability and building your deck to maybe minimize that possibility?
I could do that. I think that's a really good one, but that one must realize it's already quite intricate. There are some steps, and I really lined up an episode because we got like step by step approach. But again, like I think I also said in the opening, it brings us back to mulligans once more, actually. So I think we can go do that. I think it's just better we start with the mulligans because we're going to use that later
Oh, of
anyway.
course, yeah. Let's get
Because you need
started
you
with.
need you need to you need to factor in the mulligans regardless.
I see.
Because and then you can actually extend it. So imagine that you have a deck of cards and you want to figure out what's the chance I actually mulligan here. Let's just say you want to, check that out. That could be a thing. And what you have to think about here, you're actually looking for the probability of opening with 0 Pokemon in your hand, 0 basic Pokemon. And that's essentially what you have to do, right? And the way I like to do it is I use this distribution known as the hypergeometric distribution. It has a super catchy name. I know it. But what it essentially it does, and the way I want people to think about it, you segment your deck either in your head or you write it on a piece of paper or you do it like in Excel. I'm doing it right now. You're gonna hear me clicking in the back because I'm just gonna do it as we go along. And imagine you segment your deck into two pieces here: the basics and the rest. So in other words, the thing you're interested in hitting or not hitting, say, and then the remainder. That's essentially what we're thinking about here. So if I want to ask you, like, suppose we have 10 basics in our deck, right? That seems, or should we go higher? Like, what is a common number of basics nowadays?
I think 10. I'm thinking if like a Gardevoir deck plays about 10. I think that seems
Yeah,
about right.
10. We can always adjust it. So let's think about 10. So I'm gonna write up here. We have for basics. Basics. We have 10. I have that here on my note sheet, but everybody can follow along at home. And just imagine you write down you have 10 basics. Okay. Then I'm gonna reference to all the things in Excel, but you can also do in Google Sheets or whatnot. It's just to really get an idea for how this works. So we're interested in hitting no basics, or not per se interested, but that's what we want to calculate, right? And the way you do this is by using some combination formula. It's called combin in Excel. So it calculates combination of cards. And you essentially want to look at this. You have 10 possible basics, and you want to know in how many combinations do they exist where you have none. That means that you would write combin 10, 0 in this case, because it's a choose function. So that means you have a set of 10, and you're choosing 0. And when you think about that in your head, but wait, that will just give 1. There's only one possibility of doing this. And that's true. So that's just one component of the formula, because the formula actually consists of 3 components. The 2 things I explained, that is the part of the deck you really want to hit, the part you don't want to hit, and then we have to divide it with, say, the whole thing. Explain in a moment what I mean by that. Does that make sense to you? What I'm trying to achieve here with the segmentation of different things?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Just kind of understanding that kind of taking out all of like the Pokemon terminology out of
Exactly.
your deck and just understanding it as these are the cards that I want to see, these are the cards that I do not want to see. What is the chance of that?
Exactly. So think about it. You have first these 10 that you, in this case, let's say you want to have a mulligan, so you don't want to see a basic. That's what we're trying to say here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have 10 basics, you want to see none of them. Okay? Then you have the other part of the deck. Then I can ask you, if I have 10 basics in my deck, how many other cards do I have left? I have, well, 50 cards left, right? So there's 50 other cards. And when we draw our starting hand, we want to hit all our 7 cards from that segment of the deck, right? So when we want to hit a mulligan, you want to draw 7 cards from the pool of 50 cards that are not basic. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially the way we want to do it. So you do, again, the combination formula, but this time 50, and you choose 7 from there. There's a number of combinations from that. And then all you actually have to do is multiply this with the thing we did before. That means you suddenly end up with 2 things. You end up with a combination of, in this case, 10 over 0, multiplied by a combination of 50 over 7, or 50 choose 7. And then the only thing you actually have to do here, you're thinking about, you have these combinations out of how many possible combinations of cards can I draw from my deck? And that may sound like a very complicated thing for most, but essentially what you're saying is, if you start your game and you have 60 cards in your deck, I'm assuming everybody has a legal standard 60 card deck, by the way, seems fair. And how many possible ways can you draw 7 cards from there? So you take the thing we did before, you write combin, and then you have 60, 7 this time. And you divide that with the number you had before. And if you do that in Excel, you achieve a number that says 0.25863. And what does that mean? Well, you multiply that with 100 and you get the percentage value. So you multiply this with 100, and it tells you it's 25.86%. And that's it. It's 25.8% chance of hitting a mulligan. So roughly a quarter. 1 in 4, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually it. It's actually, that is all that's to it. To calculate a mulligan. I think that was the shortest way I could do it, at least.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think what does help is treating your deck more like just like kind of raw numbers and like blank cards that are just either the card you want or the card you don't want, because when you're asking the question of, well, what are all the different possibilities of hands you can get, well, that can get a little overwhelming. It's like, well, one hand could have research, boss, a basic, evolution. But if you're thinking in more of, well, this hand could have a basic and 6 non-basics. This hand could have 7 basics. This hand could have 7 non-basics. Like, I think that thinking of your deck that way, as the cards you want versus the cards you don't, allows it to be a little more easy to process some of that math.
You're absolutely right. It's all about generalizing and all about making like simple notation. And our notation becomes very simple. You either have a basic or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
The deck becomes binary in that sense. So every time you want to calculate anything that you want to hit a specific item of, you could think about as the deck has two components: the things you want to hit and the things you don't want to hit. That's essentially it. And in the particular case of mulligans, you should think about that we have 10 basics from which you don't want to hit anything, and you got 50 remaining cards from which you want to hit all 7. That's actually it. And what a follow-up question I often get is, so what does it matter that I add one basic to my deck? Does it really matter a lot? Well, all you have to do is you do exactly the same approach. You just have to change, instead of 10 over 0, it's now 11 basics over 0. And you drop the 50 to 49, because now when you have one more basic, you have one less of other cards. Otherwise, the thing stays the same. And then you drop already from 25 something all the way down to 22.24%. You make a more than a 3 percentage point drop just by adding one basic.
Mm-hmm.
It may not seem like a lot, and isolated in one game, it doesn't feel like a lot. But if you go in and you play 9 rounds, right, in an event, and you at least play 2 games, then it's 18 games. Then these 3%, they really start mattering a lot.
Yes.
And remember, any additional basic you add, that assuming that is a decent basic, is, one basic more than that Luminion you don't want to start.
And I think that this really matters a lot. I mentioned a little bit at the beginning for decks that play just like one type of card, like the Stonejourner deck we had last format, like a few years
Exactly.
back, Gardevoir Sylveon, where you'd play 4 Gardevoir Sylveon and maybe like one other thing. I had a friend who mulliganed, I think, 7 or 8 times once with Gardevoir Sylveon. So if you're playing a deck like that, you need to feel confident that you will very likely mulligan multiple times. What is your game plan now that your opponent's starting with a 10 card hand?
That is actually a very good point, because often I can actually at this point not recall anybody who actually took this into consideration when they chose a deck. Like, at least they haven't told me. And it's something when you think about, like, say, Gardevoir Sylveon, you just think about what the matchups are and whatnot. But in this particular case, I don't think you would think about that you actually on average make your opponent's starting hand better. And against any deck, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, we assume that the more cards they have in their starting hand, the better the hand is. Or at least the higher probability that they have what they need in order for a decent turn 1, say. So it's a really interesting consideration that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about. So it's very, very interesting. I think, at least.
Yeah, I think so as well.
So I think at this point, like, if you want to talk Luminion, we can talk Luminion, but fair warning to everybody out there that becomes a little more, say, tricky.
I see. Yeah, I do keep kind of thinking back to that idea of then, now that you've decided that maybe you have like your 10 basics versus your 50 non-basics, well, then you have to start dividing those basics into basics you want versus basics you don't want.
Exactly.
Does that become much more complicated now?
We could just go for that. We could just go for that. So imagine we go for those 10 basics, right? And then the first thing we have to think about, let's say one of those basics is Luminion. I think that's a really good example these days, because I cannot imagine a situation where you think Luminion, that is perfectly fine to start with. It'll be one strange deck for sure. Although the attack is decent, it shuffles itself away into the deck, so you could reuse the ability, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in general, I wouldn't consider it a good starting Pokemon. So let's go from that assumption. Then, using exactly the same framework here, we can do this in a number of actually steps. And the mulligan step, we actually done already. So that's one of the steps for later we already completed. So that's why we're just going to assume there's still 10 basics in the deck, right? Now, think about it the following way. First, we have to figure out what's the chance that our Luminion is even among our first 7 cards. That's the first thing we need to consider. And why is that so important? Well, yes, you need it in your 7 cards, otherwise you can't start it. But I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, yeah, but wait. If we start another basic next to Luminion, we're fine. And that's true. But first we need to know what's the chance it's even among the first 7 cards. Does that make sense?
Yes, so not just getting one of those 10 basics, it's getting specifically one of those 10 basics.
Exactly. So if we go for it, I'm going to write here step 1, get Luminion. Or, have Luminion in hand. Have a fish in hand. That's what I'm going to spell, because my other way of saying that I can't spell to Luminion. Luminion. Okay, I probably can, but let's not try that. So if I go for the same idea, we have 1 Luminion in deck. That means that there's, 1 card in there. And we want to, for this particular calculation, we want to hit it. So that becomes a combination of 1, essentially. So in terms of writing it up in an Excel way or combination way, you're having a 1 choose 1 formula, combine 1, 1. And that doesn't need a lot of calculations to know there's only one option here. If you do this one, it's going to give you the value of 1. Because there's only one possible way you can draw 1 card from a deck of 1 card. It only exists one way, for as far as I know. So the first part of the formula becomes combine 1, 1. Because you have 1 Luminion, you want to hit the Luminion. Okay. Now, what about the rest? Well, we have 6 other cards in our starting hand we're drawing, and they've been drawn from the remainder of the 59 cards. So you get combine 59 over 6, because we're drawing the 6 remaining cards. And then we're back at exactly the same as before. You have to divide everything here with all possible combination of drawing from your deck, which means divide by combine 60 over 7. And that gives you a probability of 11.67% of opening with Luminion in your hand. We're not there yet, but this is just the probability of that 1 Luminion is among your 7 cards. You follow?
Yes. But
feel free to always just barge in.
I get it. But obviously there is now one more big step to get through, right?
We have one other thing, because remember now, we have one thing here. What about no other basics in there? We need to actually calculate the probability now of hitting no other basics next to this little Luminion. Does that make sense also?
Yes.
So that will be step 2. I'm going to write up here, step 2, no other basics. That means that, essentially it means that in the 6 other cards, there should be no basics. And what does that actually mean yet again? Well, we can do this in 2 ways. We can either make the calculation for what's the probability of having exactly 1 basic. In the other 6 cards, exactly 2 basics, exactly 3, 4, 5, and 6, and add all these probabilities up together. That's one way of doing it. It's a little tedious, but it will certainly work. Or we can just say, what's the probability of essentially having 0 basics in the last pile here? So I did not try that version before, because when I did this video back in the day, I did the really step-by-step long route. But for convenience, I'm going to try the short one. So we have, we have 9 other basics in the deck, right? Yes, we do. Because we had 10 bases in our deck, so there's 9 other bases in our deck. We want to hit none of those. Okay. We have, aside from the 9 other cards in the deck, we have, how many are there then left? Let's think about that for a second. We have a deck of 59 cards now, because 1 is Luminion that's already sitting in our hand. And we have 9 basics there. That means there's 50 other cards. Okay. And we want to hit all our cards from there. And then again, we have to divide this now with, we don't have a 60 card deck anymore. We have a 59 card deck. So 59, and then we draw 6 from that pile. I hope this will be correct. Otherwise, I have to do some recalculation and recalibration and stuff on the run. But I think this will make sense. Let's try this out. Yeah, I'm just gonna go for it. If this doesn't work, we can always revisit this later.
Of course.
I'm doing a little bit on the whim here, but I think that the logic of it makes sense. So, just to bring everybody up to speed, one of our cards in our hand is Luminion. We need to know what the probability of any of the other 6 cards in our hand is not a basic. That's the goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
which means we are drawing 6 cards from our stack, extra. And then we have to calculate what's the probability of none of those are basics. So that means, translate into the whole formula business, we first have 9 basics left from which we want to hit none. And then we have 50 other cards left from which we want to hit all 6. And then divide by all possible combination of those 6 cards from a 59 card deck. Yeah, that's the step by step. Yeah, and then because we already done the mulligan, we're almost there. There's actually 5 steps, but the rest is actually easy. The hard work is done. You'll be happy to hear that, by the way, that the hard work is already done. Because now we have 2 separate events we have calculated. We have the event that Luminion is on our hand, and the event that none of them are basic. None of the others are basic. In statistic terms, we can call these 2 events independent of one another. And what does that actually mean? That means that just because we have Luminion in our first card doesn't influence our probability of hitting other basics in the 6 others. They are not related.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Just because you draw Luminion first has nothing to do with what you're going to draw the next 6 cards.
Yes, I understand that.
And that concept opens up to something very, very neat. That means when 2 events are independent, we can just take the true probabilities we have calculated and multiply them with each other. That's what it means. There's an independence rules that says the probability of both of those independent events happening, if they're independent, that is, you can just multiply their individual probabilities. So that's already step 3. Then you have actually calculated the probability of opening only Luminion. And I can tell everybody who's listening out there, the probability of opening only Luminion following this gives you a nice value of 4.12%.
So not too bad.
No, but
1 in 20 games, about.
1 in 20 games roughly, and then but the quick viewer out there will say you forgot something, and then you go like, uh-oh, what did we forget? I told you there was 5 steps, right?
Oh, true.
Yeah, and that means we need to control for mulligans, and that was why we calculate mulligans first. Because there exists, the 4th step is we need to factor for mulligans, because remember, every time you have a mulligan, you reshuffle and do it again. That essentially, what does that mean? It actually means that there are more draws from which this bad situation can happen. So what's actually going to happen right now is that we're going to calculate the probability of mulligan for a 10-card deck. And here comes the really good news is we have already done that, because that's what we did in our first little example. That was the 25.86%, or roughly 1 in 4 games.
I
So
see.
step 4.
So yeah. So in 1 out of 4 of your games with your 10-card deck, you actually have to go back in your deck, and then there's another chance you can get the Luminion because you mulligan.
Exactly. You're absolutely right on that. So that brings us to the very final thing. How do we actually combine this and control for it? Like, there's a lot of, say, mathematical manipulation you can do here and whatnot. But essentially all we have to do now is take the probability we found before for opening just Luminion, the 4.12%, and divide that by 1 minus having a mulligan. And long story short, that will weigh this outcome and factor in the probability of mulligans, and we will get the actual true number. So that means I'm going to write here, we're going to take our result from before, we're going to divide that by 1 minus the mulligan probability that we got. And let me see if I'm doing this, well, say, correctly. I may or may not have done a mistake, but if I get a mistake, we'll calculate it. We'll fix it as we go along, right? Because I'm getting something that is a little tricky here. Let me see. I made a typo. Making typos is very interesting. It's because when I translate for mulligans, I multiply by 100. And if I do that, it kind of messes up everything. You need to be consistent in your denomination. But okay, I fixed my typo. So that gives you a true probability of this happening of 5.55%. And
Okay.
that's the final answer, actually.
Hmm.
For a 10 card deck, for a 10 basic deck with one Luminion, the probability of opening only Luminion happens 5.55% of the time. So you can again go back and say, with a little grain of salt, 1 in 20 games.
I see.
And
So,
that's essentially it.
yeah. So for some people, not too bad. Others' perspectives might be that's terrible, right?
It's kind
um,
of like we've been there already, and everybody has to remember, regardless of how unlikely something seems, it will happen eventually. Like
mhm.
you play a deck like this, no matter how basic, suppose you really want to go out there and you want to be safe. You don't want to start any Luminion. You think, I'm going to play 25 basics because then, I'm safe, right? Well, the truth is, it can still happen.
Mhm.
It's just very unlikely, but it can still happen.
um,
Yeah.
you mentioned this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but to what extent do you think players should be accounting um, for things like this when building their decks? Specifically, maybe like you know, maybe they feel their deck is inconsistent, so they say, well, let's add a support Pokemon. Well, let's add another support Pokemon. Well, let's add this tech for a matchup. And now every other game, you're starting with a card you don't want. How much thought do you think should be put in when deck building with things like this?
I think this is a really interesting question first because this comes back to like, should I just net deck something or should I try and build my own deck? And here we're assuming you're really trying to build your own deck. Say if you build something from scratch, you really have to think a lot about this because when you build something from scratch, of course, you're not leaning up against a pre-existing list or so, and then you have to put much more thought into this. Whereas if you actually just you take a deck from say Limitless website, great source, you find, okay, I like this deck, but I want to play this tech for a matchup, right? But you also realize this tech here is very good, of course, for that matchup you're taking it for. Otherwise, why would you do it? But it's horrible to start with. Absolutely horrendous. You don't want to start with it.
Mm-hmm.
And there you have to actually really make some thought go into this. Is this actually worth it? And there comes the whole idea: how many times do I expect I'm gonna need it? Because we also heard about that you check for a certain matchup and then you completely misread the meta and there was nobody who played it, or so few that in a big event you never saw it. And then you just played a useless card that was a liability in any other game.
Yeah.
And it happened to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's something in short, yes, you should certainly think about it, but should you really put a lot of thought into it? I'm unsure. Like, no, let me put it in a different way. You just should not if you're already doing a pre-existing deck, but if you're building from scratch, you should think more about it. I think that's how I would put it together.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I'm thinking of kind of two pretty like relevant examples for that. Like one being like playing Pumpkaboo and Lugia, where
Yeah.
it kind of depends on, well, how much path to the peak are you expecting, right? Because Pumpkaboo is the easiest way to stop path to the peak because you can search it, unlike a stadium, but you do not want to start Pumpkaboo. So how are you kind of assessing the risk of hitting a deck that is going to play a bunch of path to the peak versus the risk of starting that Pumpkaboo? Which one do you think outweighs the other?
I think it's a super cool example because the Luminion actually fits in the same box because it's the same deck all of a sudden, right? And
Yes.
now, what are you actually telling me here? There's more than one basic in the deck you don't want to start with, and this only becomes worse.
Yes.
But then again, this is also the one deck, at least for Luminion, it's still bad to start with, but well, in Lugia's case, you can just, when Archeops hits the field, you can charge Lugia, sorry, you could charge Luminion. Well, right now you cannot really do it, but in the previous format you could because we had Aurora energy. Then it
Yes.
was easy to do. And someone would say, yeah, but we're gonna get luminous energy or whatever it's called now. Yeah, but there's another problem with that energy. If you attach another special energy next to it, it becomes a colorless also, so it doesn't really work, does it now? So it's
Yeah.
still making Luminion a super bad starter.
Yeah, I think I misread Luminous the first time I read it. I thought it was that it's a rainbow and it makes all the other special energy colorless. No, it makes itself colorless. So it's pretty useless in Lugia unless you have like a Radiant Charizard for the last turn of the game. Other than that, it's essentially a colorless energy.
And for us who have played for a much longer time, I don't even call it that. I don't call it luminous energy. I call it multi energy because that's what the old
Yes.
print was of this card.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah, we got reverse energy, used to be scramble energy.
Yeah, I say scramble. Like I
Yes.
didn't even know it was called reversal.
Hmm.
No idea. I just called it scramble because essentially same effect. The
Yes.
idea is at least exactly the same.
Hmm.
But there are some small intricate changes, of course. But because I believe scramble you could not even attach to a basic Pokemon, and
Yes.
and reversal you can. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, a reversal. I mean, the common example is Gardevoir. Like you could put it on a Ralts, and you always have the threat of evolving it into a Gardevoir and using the attack. If you're gonna research it away, you could just attach it.
That's exactly true. No, no, that's true. That's a big difference because that means the old scramble was worse, but the
Mm-hmm.
idea was the same. It was a triple when you're behind. Now all we need now is they reprint double rainbow, and then we're back in the good old days, as it seems.
We're almost there. We're almost there.
Almost, we're almost there. We're so
Yes.
close.
Um, Now, yeah, this entire lesson was unbelievably helpful and very interesting. And for anyone who's kind of at any point might have been wanting some support with following along, I'll also reference it at the beginning of the video, but please check out Pokemath episode number 1 and episode number 2, both of which will be in the show notes, talking about the hypergeometric formula. and
It sounds much more scary than it is, I swear.
and talking about starting your support Pokemon. So if you want to see some of that a little bit more in action in video, feel free to check out those videos, both of which will be in the show notes. Now, Stefan, do you mind if I ask you maybe like a maybe not as fast as lightning, but a couple short form answers for a couple of the other like big probability things that come up in Pokemon that I've
Sure,
noticed?
sure. Try me, but I cannot guarantee that this is gonna be the best, my best performance ever. But shoot.
Of course. Well, I think I'll start off with a controversial one. You do have a video called "Why Seven Riffle Shuffles is Not Optimal."
Ooh, yeah, I
Could
know.
you tell
It's
us
a
a
hot
little
potato.
bit about shuffling and what maybe we're doing wrong?
Now, the shortest possible way I can say this, seven is was the so when they invented this formula for how many shuffles it takes, seven was essentially not even the number that came out. That's actually the fact. And the point with this was, seven is not always optimal because in Pokemon especially, the size of your deck varies as the game progresses, which
Mm,
means that always shuffling seven, sometimes it's the good number, other times you're overdoing it. And especially when you start the game, and if you want to use the formula calculated, I think for a normal 52 card deck, which is what it was based on, the formula back in the day, it gave you 8.55. And that's for the quick person out there, that's not seven. that's that's a higher number. And of course, if I now have a 60 card deck, that number is slightly higher. It's 8 point a little higher. It's closer to 9. So that means, in essence, you should riffle more than 9 times when you actually set up for a game, not 7.
hmm,
But then again, 7 is seemed as enough for more intricate reasons. But in short, 7 is not always the answer.
interesting. How I don't know if you know the answer to this, but like how do they quantify like a deck that is like shuffled, like considered it has now been shuffled adequately? How is that quantified?
So that's what you define as what is sufficiently random. And the answer here is, from a mathematical point of view, you want to be that the probability of any card being anywhere or any possible arrangement, whatnot, has to be uniform. That means no matter what card you have, the probability of the card being anywhere in the deck should be the same. So if you
Hmm.
play your one Luminion, whether it's the card on the top of your deck, second card, bottom card, middle somewhere, should be the same probability. Should be equal probability for wherever that card is. That is perfectly random. Now,
Mm-hmm.
to achieve this, that takes a hell of a time actually in practice. That's why we go for sufficiently random.
Yes. And that's why things like I think in Magic it's called like mana weaving is considered cheating
Ooh, yeah,
because you
don't even
might
start with that.
yeah, because in the back of your head you might think, well, if my starting hand is Luminion and 6 energy, did I really shuffle my deck? Is this really random? This doesn't seem right. Shouldn't I be getting an equal amount of everything consistently? That is a bit of a fallacy, isn't it?
It's a fallacy. It is in shortest possible way. Yes, it's a fallacy because if it's random, any possible hand is a go, right? Like that means you could just start Lumineer 6 energies and it will happen. If I start with a nice distribution of all the good cards, that's because I've been, well, I believe the term we sometimes use is declumping, or what is it called? Yeah, mana weaving over in Magic is definitely what they, you sort around your deck and you have it in blocks. And that relates back to a certain shuffle that is not a shuffle, which is actually a counting technique. But if I start on that, I'm going to rant for the next hour about why that is not a shuffling technique, but more of a counting technique. But in short, no, it's a fallacy. It's definitely a fallacy.
Yes. Now I have one other question, which I'm gonna do a bit of a deep cut. I don't know if this is a subject that you'll feel knowledgeable about, but I'll give it a shot.
More for fun.
So I've been in situations before in a tournament where we're in the last round of the event of like a cup. Maybe there's
Yeah.
two players who are already locked in for top cut, and there's 8 players left with a record
Ooh,
that
yeah.
might be able to make top cut. Some of the players want to play it out. Some of the players want to ID. They'll have varying levels of resistance. I believe this is where things like game theory come into play a little bit.
A
Who's
bit.
gonna
Bit,
ID?
yeah.
Who's gonna play it out? Um, I don't know. I guess I don't know necessarily if I have a question about that, but could you tell us a little bit about how math is involved maybe in situations like that?
I thought about making an extra video about this for so long for this topic. I have something. One of my topics does deal with it. I cannot for life of me remember which episode it is, but I talk about when to ID and when not to ID. There's definitely some questions about this. And the whole point is if suppose two are locked in, that's 6 spots left, and you have 8 players fighting for the spots. And if everybody IDs, well, there's going to be 2 people who's going to be sad because they're going to bubble. That's what we call it, right? Bubbling.
Mm-hmm.
And but here's the thing: if I sit and want to play a game against somebody, and I see somebody they're definitely going to play, and I'm sure they're going to play, then if they play, there's a reasonable chance that that game does not end in a tie, which means that there's one person of those two who's going to fall out. This is where your game theory idea comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
What am I going to do thinking about what other people are going to do? That's essentially what you're asking.
Yes.
And here, for every other game that is doing that, the better it is that you ID. I think. This is again just my own opinion, but imagine 2 of the other tables decides to play, and the other 2 they ID. And then given that those 2 tables who decide to play, actually there's found a winner, then there's nobody bubbling anymore. You have a clean cut all of a sudden. And then IDing for the other 2 tables was a very good idea. And that, of course, depends on what is the probability they're going to end in a tie. And are they going to observe that you tied because they played? And then they can later say, like, oh, we're going to tie anyway. But that's very unlikely they're going to do that. Because you're only allowed, by the rules at least, to offer an ID once. If you play it really, really by the book.
Mm-hmm.
There are, of course, cases where a lot of players, they go like, they start the game and they go like, do you want to ID? And the one goes no. And then they play 2 games and it's 1-1. And then they ask again, do you want to ID now? And then they say, of course, yes, because, well, it's very likely it's going to be in a tie anyway. But technically speaking, you can only ask for an ID once. I believe that's what the rule says. And then somebody out there will probably nag me for that, but look it up somewhere. It's probably there. But that's definitely something. I don't know if you know this, but there was once I was on board on an app called the Swiss Standing Calculator that could be used to actually calculate this exact scenario.
Mm.
So a friend of mine, Lars Andersen, he was the programmer behind this looking into. We had such an app on the App Store once, and of course, or unfortunately, it expired and we don't have it anymore. It's many years ago. And you do have the tool on Limitless that can help you, or when you're sitting in the last round, you can often count it. So it's quite nice. But here, there's a lot of game theory elements into it. But if I would sit in the tournament and you assume everything is by the book, if I see other tables that are in the interesting scenario playing, it makes my it makes my reasoning for IDing that much more ideal. I'll be much more likely to ID. But then again, both players have to agree. And if the other player doesn't just for whatever reason want to play or don't understand what's going on, or for other reason just don't want to ID. It's also fine. You have to respect their decision. It's the player's decision.
Hmm. Yeah, and
Yeah,
that leads to kind of some interesting scenarios where, like, in an ideal world, everyone asks to ID once, they say yes or no. Every game begins at the exact same time. But in reality, I know people are kind of looking to their left, looking to their right, thinking like, is that table playing it out? Is that table playing it out? And kind of in your example, if all of the tables end up playing it out, then you end up in a situation where of those 8 players, 4 make cut, and then some players who were originally ineligible for cut, if everyone ID'd, now can bubble in. So it actually
exactly,
affects
because there will
beyond those eight
exactly.
players.
And there's a lot of players or a lot of people out there in general, they argue against IDing. It should be illegal because it's for what they believe not spirit of the game. I'm not going to touch these exact arguments, but there are like the opinions out there that means that you should just not ID in the first place
Hmm.
because it's not fair to other players and so forth. Just want to raise that that's actually a consideration as well. That some players they don't want to ID out of principle. I would just say if you're in a case where you both would ID and you're both safe, like suppose there is a situation where you are at a cut with 5 rounds. After 3 rounds, you're 3-0. You sit up in table one, and you ask to ID, you should always say yes. No questions asked. You should always say yes. Because if you ID the last 2 rounds, and even if you ID the first one and then have to play the next one, you even end up losing, there's still a very high probability you're in cut. Cut. And so there are situations where you just should ID. There's no risk.
Yes.
But other cases like the one you presented here first, that's tricky. But a lot of players, or not a lot of players, but some players will argue you shouldn't even be able to ID or you shouldn't ID because it's against the spirit of the game or something. So there's just a lot of considerations to take into this.
Hmm. That is very interesting. And I think to start wrapping this up, I think that touches on just one last thing that came to mind for me is like when players are talking about performing at like regionals or internationals, or especially like the really big regionals that are like 1,200, 1,300 plus players,
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
you're 6-2 going into round 9. And then the question kind of is, should I ID or should I play it out? Because those 2 extra match points might be the
Uh-huh.
make or break between me making top 8 the next day. But then, maybe I want to be 7-2 and make a run for top 8. Maybe my opponent wants their first day 2. Um, you know,
This is a really interesting situation. I have tried not to touch it so much, but what I think I can say about it is it really depends on what your goal with the event is, of course. You're touching that as well there.
mhm,
And it's a relatively new discussion because in the beginning, where there were just regionals where we were 400-500 players, it was often just ID when you can to get to day 2 and everybody was happy. And there's a reasonable chance to make top 8 still. Now, in the meantime, when regionals, internationals are so large, and first and foremost, you do play an extra round of Swiss after 800 players, but when you reach 1,200, 1,500 like at UIC, or God knows how many we're going to get over at NAIC,
yeah.
these numbers here, if you're in it to win it, you're not gonna ID. You shouldn't ID if you're in it to win it, because I have a firm belief, but I need to actually simulate this. I would like to disclaim I've not done that. But if you go 19 points, it will be incredibly difficult, if not almost impossible, to make top 8,
Mhm.
even with a 6-0 record the next day. Because a 6-0 record, what does that bring you? It brings you 18 match points on top of your 19 match points, putting you at 37. And then we can start looking in the past. Well, 37 is usually fine. It's usually all good, sunshine and rainbows. No problem, you make top 8. But I know that when the regionals or internationals are becoming this big, it's actually in danger for not being enough. Again, I need to check this, but I know at least now with a score of 501, you cannot make it. We actually have evidence of that actually happening recently.
Mhm.
That a player with 19 points going in goes 501 on the second day, which I believe is I think objectively speaking, that's a very respectable day 2 score.
Yes, yes, yes,
Um,
for sure.
very good day 2 score, and the person ended up being ninth, like
Mm.
bubble out. So yes, the person might as well have been in, but the whole point was, even with a 501 score with 19 points, was not even safe for top 8. That actually sounds almost crazy. The question is just, yes, 6-0 would definitely have made it there, but when we're approaching, say, closer to the 2,000 player mark in a pot like this, with still no additional rounds of Swiss being played, then it sounds like going in with 19 points, yes, you get to play day two, but you're playing for, not top eight.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, the question of IDing if you're there. Should you not? If you're in it to win it, no, you play it out to get more match points. But you're gonna have a lot of players over there who are gonna be like, if I make day two, I certainly get my points, which means my invite.
Yes.
This is
Yes.
where, if
Yes.
that's the objective, then you definitely want to ID. You don't want to sit there and play that game. You just want to ID knowing that I make day two and I get top at least some points, I guess, because points internationals already start very high in general.
Yes.
So it's a very nice chunk of points you can get, and they'll definitely get your invite for it. There's a lot of players out there who literally just have to hit points at NAIC and then they're safe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a super cool question. I think it's super interesting. I have a few people out there. I bet when they hear this, they're going to sit down and start with their simulations, and hopefully they can do the dirty work that I've been too lazy to do, and tell us whether say you have almost 2,000 players, you go in with 19 points, can you actually make top eight with a 6-0 score?
Yes.
That's
When day two is
interesting.
200 players, right? What do
When
you
day
do
two
there?
is two, yeah, because we are day two 200 exactly.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Stefan, I think in that on that note, we will start to wrap up. Do you have any kind of final comments or things to bring up before we wrap up?
I think I said enough already. I think I thought, we could do this in 20 minutes. No, we could not do this in 20 minutes. But I really, really want to say thank you for having me here. I always love to talk about these things, and I hope I didn't bore too many out there. And anybody's free to always reach out and just ask any questions. And I'm gladly will enter into the discussion and learn more. I think this is super interesting, and I hope everybody out there, or at least some out there, will also find this very interesting. So again, thanks for having me.
Of
Really, thank you.
course. Yeah, and thank you so much. And one last thing I totally forgot is last week you mentioned you were going to go to your first league challenge for points for this season, and I heard
Yeah,
you got some points. So
I
congratulations.
I I managed. Yes, so I finished the season at 10 points, which is definitely more than zero. So I'm happy.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Stefan, I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I think this might air after NAIC, but I hope you have a good time at NAIC.
Well, I would have a good time, but I'm not going.
Oh, goodness. I'm
I'm
so
not
sorry. I
going.
am so
It's
sorry. I've
okay.
talked to
It's
so many
okay.
people, I'm starting to get a little bit mixed up. I'm
It's
sorry
okay.
about
I
that.
wish everybody the best of luck over at NAIC. It's certain to be a fantastic event. It's going to be excellent, excellent staff, I'm sure, and it's going to be absolutely a really great experience. I don't doubt that for a second. And all the best to all the players out there. I hope you're going to go and have fun.
Of course. Thank you so much. All right. Well, have a great day, Stefan. Thank you again for speaking with us.
Bye bye.
See ya. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to Stefan for being so generous with his time. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one, please consider giving the podcast a follow, review, or rating wherever you're listening. Or if you want to follow us on social media, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at memcappodcast. If you want to see me post about my own TCG experiences, you can follow me on Twitter at RZGladys. I hope you have a great day, and thank you for listening.